Let's identify the parts of the small intestine. So again, the stomach, the distal portion of the stomach, or the pyloric region, has an intimate connection with the first part of the small intestine. The pancreas also has an intimate connection with this first part of the small intestine as well. First part of the small intestine is the shortest part of the small intestine. It's known as the duodenum, so we can see that here. The jejunum is the next part of the small intestine, so here we see the majority of the small intestine. This proximal portion of the small intestine here, this middle piece, is known as the jejunum, and then the distal portion of the small intestine here is known as the ileum. So the most proximal part of the small intestine is the duodenum, next is the jejunum, and then finally we have the ileum. If we look internally at the mucosa of the small intestine, we can see that the mucosa of the small intestine is thrown into folds, very similar to the folds in the mucosa of the stomach, the rugae in the mucosa of the stomach. These folds or ridges we can see very well here in the duodenum. These are called plicae circularis. We also see them here at the distal part of the ileum. Those ridges are continuous and they're found in all parts of the small intestine. The ileocecal valve is going to be a valve, a smooth muscle cuff, very similar to our cardiac sphincter and our pyloric sphincter. This ileocecal valve right here is going to be a cuff of muscle tissue that is able to regulate the contents that move from the small intestine into the first part of the large intestine. Here is the beginning of our large intestine. This pouch-like area of the beginning part of the large intestine is known as the cecum. Contents are going to move from the small intestine into the cecum, and then they are going to travel in this direction. Since those contents are moving upward or ascending through the large intestine, this part of the large intestine, or the colon, is called the ascending portion, so the ascending colon here. That material then moves through the large intestine in this direction or across. It moves kind of in a transverse way, so that we would identify as our transverse colon. And then that material is going to move through this portion of the large intestine here, and it is moving downward, and we would refer to that as our descending colon. The sigmoid colon is the next part of the colon, and the sigmoid colon begins about here and has a bit of a tortuous or a contorted shape to it. It actually moves medially, it moves superiorly, and then inferiorly. Much of that sigmoid colon is actually covered in this model by some of the small intestine. So the sigmoid colon would start here, it would travel medially, it would move up and then down, and as soon as that sigmoid colon kind of moves down, that's when that distal portion of the colon becomes the rectum, which we'll get to shortly. There are two flexures of the colon to be able to identify. This flexure here is known as the hepatic flexure, and that is because this part of the colon that has kind of a flexed or a bent shape to it sits just inferior to the liver, so this is our hepatic flexure. The liver in this model is up here, but in an actual cadaver or in a patient, the liver would be sitting just atop that hepatic flexure. The splenic flexure, again, is another bend in the colon or the large intestine, and we can see this flexure or this bent part of the large intestine near the spleen, known as the splenic flexure. The rectum, again, is going to be that distal portion of the large intestine or the colon. We see that here. This would be the end of our sigmoid colon here and our rectum in this location. Tinea coli. So the tinea coli are bands of smooth muscle that run through the large intestine. We can see these bands of smooth muscle here. These bands allow the large intestine to change its length in an effort to propel fecal material through that colon. Because of the bands of smooth muscle that run the length of the colon, their contraction and relaxation forms these little pouches or pockets within the large intestine, and each of these pockets or pouches are known as a haustra. The final structure to identify that's associated with the colon of the large intestine is this structure here that's attached to the beginning part of the colon. This structure is known as the appendix. It's part of your lymphatic system, and it contains lymphoid tissue. It's a tissue that contains white blood cells and cells that are able to monitor the large intestine for excessive pathogenic bacteria.